everyone. Before we jump into today's class, I still have a couple of announcements. Our exam will gonna be this Friday. The exam covers everything from monetary policy all the way through the today's topic on market equilibrium. The format will gonna be super similar. We'll have 25 multiple choices with three calculation-based questions, and you'll have an hour and 15 minutes to complete it. So yeah, try to, go all over the materials, including videos, that will gonna help you a lot. And also if you still have enough time, please go hop into Macmillan questions, practices, all gonna help you a lot. And also we'll have a quiz next Tuesday, June 16th. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all. Today is actually a very important class because we're bringing all together several ideas and we've already learned. So, yeah, we're gonna talk about demand, supply, and finally, you know, adding all up together to the equilibrium. So probably this will gonna be the one of the most useful tools in all of introductory economics. So let's start. So I brought a very quick reminder from last classes. I hope you'll remember. So a market was simply a group of buyers and sellers interacting with each other, right? And buyers determine demand and sellers determine supply, right? We also discussed what the competitive market is, which was there are many buyers and sellers and nobody has enough power to individually control the market price. And that was the reason we called sellers as price takers. So keep this idea in mind because today's equilibrium topic that assumes competitive markets. So another quick review is the laws. So remember the two fundamental laws. So first one was the law of demand, which tells us when price falls, the quantity demanded will gonna increase. And on the other hand, the law of supply tells us that when price rises, quantity supplied will gonna be increased. So that's why demand slopes downward and supply slopes upward. So everything we're doing today comes from these two simple relationship. So I think if you understand these two laws, equilibrium becomes much easier to understand. Now we're getting into today's main topic. So when we call equilibrium, what does that mean? So it's pretty simple because a market is in equilibrium when quantity supplied equals to quantity demanded. So let's think about what that really means, right? So that means the amount of customers wants to buy is exactly equal to the amount of producers wants to sell. So nobody is left wanting more or nobody is left with extra inventory. So we can say that the market is totally balanced. We call the price where this happens as the equilibrium price, and we call the quantity where this happens the equilibrium quantity. So I brought some figures over there. So we learned supply itself and demand itself. When we combine it together, you can see the intersection, and that point, we're gonna call it as equilibrium. So let's think about a simple example. Suppose let's talk about Hobojo again. So suppose Hobojo wants to sell 100 cups of coffee today, and maybe customers also want to buy exactly 100 cups of coffee at the current price. Then what will gonna happen, right? You know, everything works smoothly because like that's equilibrium. Because like seller wants to sell like specific amount, and customer also wants the exact like specific amount to get. So like notice what happens at the intersection of like supply and demand. Like the supply curve like tells us what producers wants to do. And in the same sense, like the demand curve tells us what customer wants to do. So the only place where the both sides agree will gonna be intersection. And that's why economists like spend so much time looking for that point. You know, One thing I always like tell students is like, like when you see a supply and demand graph on an exam, your eyes should immediately go to the like intersection point. That's usually where the story begins. So in equilibrium, like, every seller who wants to sell can find a buyer, and also like and every buyer who wants to buy can find a seller. So that means there is like no shortage, no surplus. So like everything is like super balanced. Let's talk about like shifts and movements along the curves once more. This we already covered last time, but remember the difference between like movement along the curve and a shift of a curve, right? If a good's like own price changes, then we move along the curve, right? And if something else changes, like such as like income, like population, the price of like substitutes, complements, like something like that, that all gonna shift like the entire curve. And this distinction becomes extremely, extremely important in examples we're about to do. Like we're gonna talk about this. So now we will gonna move on to like how to analyze changes in equilibrium. So like one thing I've heard a lot from the students is like how do I know like what happens to price and quantity, right? Like that sounds like pretty difficult or hard. But like the good news is there is a process which I just like wrote over there. We're gonna just like follow the step like one by one. So whenever you see some kind of like event and follow this, try to like follow these three steps. So first one is like determine whether the event affects demand, supply, sometimes like both or neither. And then like you will gonna determine the direction. So like you have to ask yourself, like does the curve shift right or left? Is it go outward or inward? Something like that. And then last step will gonna be you're gonna draw a graph, like maybe mentally or physically, and then compare the old equilibrium with the new equilibrium. Then ask, like what happened to the equilibrium price and what happened to equilibrium quantity, like something like that. So if you follow these three steps every single time, like I believe, like supply and demand problems becomes much more easier. So the biggest mistake like students make here is like just like jumping straight to the answer without like identifying like which curve shifts first. So please remember you have to decide like which curve will gonna shift in which direction. That is the most important thing you have to do. All right, so I brought some example. I wanted to like think about this like before I go hop in. So let's start. So we're going to like look at three situations over there. So first is the price of the lemon juice like increases, and second, technology improves like for producing apple juice, and third one is like both happens at the same time. So we are, as we say over there, we are considering a market for the apple juice, right? And we're gonna try to like do like those like three steps one by one, like in the case. So I'll I'll give you guys like maybe like 30 seconds to think and then like move on together. All right. So let's move on. So like first question. So first case was like the increase in the price of like lemons, and I suppose like lemon juice is a substitute of like apple juice, right? That makes sense. So in this case, does this affect supply or demand for apple juice? Have any ideas? We do have like few students here, so I want to ask like which curves will gonna affected by this event? Any ideas? All right. So maybe I will show you first. So first of all, we view like apple juice and lemon juice as substitutes. And if lemon juice like becomes more expensive, like some customers like switch to apple juice, right? So like that means demand for apple juice will gonna increases. So first step will gonna be, demand curve will gonna affect it. So now we know like that demand will gonna change, then we need to figure out which direction it could go. So as like demand will gonna be increased, which means that we have like pressure to like outward. That means like demand curve will gonna shift to the right. So as you can see in the figure, I just like brought it, right? So once after demand curves like move outward, we're gonna find, like new equilibrium, new intersection over there with a like red dot, which is like new equilibrium. And we can say that there is increase in quantity and price, both of them. So at this price, like consumers like suddenly wants to buy more apple juice than before. So like that we're gonna have like, like pressure to the outward. And then, like as we only have like supply over there, so like that we're gonna like change that. Does that make sense? I feel like I was like mumbled a little bit, but yeah. So like the result is like quite simple. Like once after you draw a like figure like this, so like we have like higher price and higher quantity. So this is like not the case of like movement along the demand curve, because like we're not talking about like the price of the goods itself. This was like the price change, in their substitute, right? So like that's the distinction like students like often miss. So try to, like combine it all together. Now, second case. So, second case was like, like there was a new technology of like producing apple juice, which means that, like we can think of this case, like producer developed like a better technology for making apple juice, then that technology will gonna affect production instead of like, demand right now. So this is like supply side change. So like the supply, we need to figure out like the supply increased or decreased. Let's like logically think like new technology to make help out, producing like apple juice. We're gonna make like the cost lower, which means that we can make more, apple juice with the same budget. So that means we're gonna have, like increased supply. So that is the reason we have like the supply curve like shifted right. And every that means like, like at every possible price, like films can now produce more apple juice. Then what happens to the equilibrium, right? Once after we draw a new like supply curve over there, now we know like new equilibrium point will gonna be over there with a like red dot over there. means that prices will gonna fall and quantity will gonna be rise. So like compare this to the like previous example, like in both cases, like like quantity increased, but in the first example, like price increased, but this time, like price decreased. And that's why identifying like which demand or supply shift is really important. And also, I brought one more. So this is where things gets like a little bit more interesting or a little bit hard. So like suppose like lemon juice becomes more expensive and new apple juice technology arrives at the same time, then what will gonna happen? We know that like demand will gonna increases and also supply will gonna increases, right? Demand increased because like customers switch from lemon juice, and then supply increased because the production cost was cheaper and production eventually becomes easier. So like now we have like both curves like shift right. So here we need to think really carefully. What happens to the quantity? What happens to the like new equilibrium, right? So demand increasing pushes the quantity up, and supply increasing also pushes like the quantity up. So both will gonna forces like move quantity in the same direction. So quantity will gonna be like 100% definitely, increases. But the problem is like, like the price. Because like price will gonna be a little trickier because like from the like previous example, we knew that, like demand increasing pushes like price upward, going up, and supply increasing pushes like price downward, right? And those two effects like work against each other. So, like what happens to price? Like that is like the question. So like you know, let's just like go directly to the answer. So like the answer is like we don't know. It really depends on which shift is larger. And we don't have like that specific information on this question. We cannot decide, but there could be, like three possible cases. The first one is when the demand shifts more. So if demand shifts more than like, the shift of like, the supply, the quantity will gonna increase and like the price will gonna increase as well. On the other hand, like the supply, if the supply shifts more, then price will gonna falls. And if they shift by similar amount or the exact amount, the price may remain roughly same. So like this is like one of the most important lessons in economics. So sometimes like the correct answer is like not a definite, like increase or decrease. So like like sometimes like we say like the effect is ambiguous because we need more information. So you have to read the question really carefully if you have like any information to use that which curves like shifts more or less, then you can decide which one is like go more or less, and then like, have exact, change in price and quantity. But if that is not the case, like you really cannot say like which one goes like higher or lower. And this is like our last page. So let's finish by discussing what happens like when markets are not equilibrium. So when markets are not equilibrium, like there would be like two cases. Like first one is like shortage and second one is surplus. Like we're gonna talk about this like after the midterm a little bit more, but yeah, let's grab some like concepts and the ideas. So like a shortage occurs like when quantity demanded exceeds, like quantity supplied. So we also call this like excess demand. And like when does this happen? I wrote down, of course, whenever price is below the equilibrium. So if you see the like figure over there, shortage happens like whenever like price is like lower than price equilibrium, which is like P2, like wherever you draw like lower than like price of like equilibrium. As you can see, like there would be a gap in between like the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. And that is a quantity of like shortage. So whenever it happens, like buyers like compete for like the limited goods available, so producers don't want to sell as much as before. So like probably like what happens, like producers will gonna raise the price. And then like that will gonna like have like upward push. So eventually we ended up, to the like equilibrium price. On the other hand, surplus occurs, like when quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. This is also called, like excess supply. So when does this happen? Yeah, when the price is above the equilibrium. So at a higher price, like producers like wants to sell a lot, right? But like probably like consumers like don't want to buy as much. So that means, like the consumers don't want to buy as much so that, products will gonna start to piling up. Maybe the inventory sits on the store, maybe, like everything will gonna unsold, right? So that to encourage their sales, producers will gonna reduce the price. And that will gonna have like downward pressure to the equilibrium price. And as prices per, the market moves back toward the equilibrium. So you have to remember that, like price below the equilibrium creates shortage and pushes prices up, and price above the equilibrium will gonna create surpluses and pushes prices down. And then markets naturally move toward to the like equilibrium. So these are all we learned, like, like we all connected like demand and supply together. And the key takeaway today will gonna be that equilibrium occurs where, quantity demanded equals to quantity supplied. And when demand or supply shift, of course their equilibrium will gonna change. And the markets are when markets are not in equilibrium, there will gonna be something called shortage and surpluses. And that situation will gonna create some pressure that pushes like prices back toward like equilibrium. So like for the exam, I want you to make sure you can do these three. So first, you need to know like how to identify whether demand or supply shift with some specific event that will gonna 100% in an exam. So, and second, you have to know like how to determine the direction of the shift. Mostly like it is kind of like, very straightforward. And lastly, you try to like predict what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. So like I'm pretty sure like if you can do those three steps, like like you'll be in excellent shape for Friday's exam. And yeah, do you have any questions about anything about exam or like today's class or something? If we don't have any questions for today, please feel free to like send me an email if you have one. Like today's class is all done. Yeah, I wish you have good result on midterm too. Like don't forget to do like go over all the videos like before the exam starts so that you wouldn't miss any points from it. If you have any questions about the exam or something, please let me know before the exam, of course. And if you have any technical issues, like please let me know like as soon as possible. All right, thank you.